There is a dream that humanity keeps having. It appears in different forms across different cultures in different centuries, but the dream is always the same. You stand before a mirror, you look at your reflection, and slowly, horrifyingly, the face looking back at you begins to change. The eyes darken, the smile twists into something unrecognizable, and in that moment of terror you realize this is not a stranger, this is you, the you that you have spent your entire life refusing to see. Carl Jung called this the shadow, and he warned us, with an urgency that bordered on prophecy, that ignoring the shadow would not make it disappear. It would make it grow. It would make it hungry. It would make it dangerous, not just to ourselves, but to everyone around us, to our relationships, to our societies, to the very fabric of civilization itself. Tonight, we descend into that darkness, not because we are morbid, not because we are nihilistic, but because Jung understood something that most of psychology refuses to acknowledge, that wholeness cannot be achieved through light alone, that healing does not come from becoming better, it comes from becoming complete. And completion means facing the parts of ourselves we have exiled into the basement of consciousness, where they fester and mutate and plot their revenge. This is not a metaphor. This is not poetry. This is the literal architecture of the human psyche. And every single person listening to these words right now carries within them a shadow self, a repository of rejected traits, forbidden desires, suppressed emotions, and disowned aspects of identity. Some of you know this intuitively. You feel it in the moments when you surprise yourself with your own cruelty, when you say something you didn't mean to say, when you act in ways that contradict everything you believe yourself to be. Others have kept the shadow so deeply buried that you no longer recognize its influence. But it is there. Oh, it is always there, operating in the background of your thoughts, influencing your choices, sabotaging your relationships, and expressing itself in ways you have learned to justify, rationalize, or simply deny. Jung spent his life studying this phenomenon. He watched as individuals destroyed themselves through shadow projection. He watched as entire nations descended into genocidal madness because they could not face their collective darkness. He watched as the most civilized societies on earth revealed themselves capable of the most unimaginable atrocities, and he understood this was not human nature revealing its evil. This was human nature revealing what happens when we refuse to integrate the fullness of who we are. Consider this. Every villain you have ever encountered in fiction resonates with you, not because they are foreign, but because they are familiar. The jealous rival, the vengeful enemy, the corrupt authority figure, the manipulative seducer. You recognize them instantly. You understand their motivations intuitively. And in your quietest, most honest moments, you might even admit, I have felt that impulse. I have had that thought. I have imagined doing that thing. But then you push it away. You tell yourself, I would never. And in that denial, in that rejection, you feed the shadow. You give it power. You make it autonomous. You create the very monster you fear becoming. The ancient Greeks understood this. They wrote tragedies about heroes destroyed by the very traits they refused to acknowledge. Oedipus, fleeing the prophecy, racing directly toward it. Achilles, denying his vulnerability, dying from the one weak spot he never protected. These were not morality tales about punishment. These were psychological warnings about the price of self-deception, about what happens when we refuse to see ourselves clearly, about the cosmic irony that our fate often emerges from the very thing we try hardest to avoid. But Jung went further. He recognized that the shadow is not just personal, it is collective. Every society creates a collective shadow, a reservoir of traits, behaviors, and characteristics that the culture deems unacceptable. And this collective shadow does not disappear simply because we agree to pretend it doesn't exist. It erupts. In witch hunts and inquisitions, in genocides and pogroms, in moral panics and political persecutions, in every historical moment When civilized people suddenly reveal themselves capable of barbarism, we are witnessing the return of the collective shadow. The repressed always returns. Always. And it returns with a vengeance proportional to the force with which it was suppressed. Think about the last time you felt intense, disproportionate hatred toward another person. The kind of hatred that seems to consume you, that feels righteous and justified. That gives you a sense of moral clarity and purpose. Now consider this possibility. You are not hating them. You are hating the part of yourself you see reflected in them, the part you have disowned, the part you cannot acknowledge. Jung called this projection. And it is the primary mechanism by which the shadow operates in the world. We take the traits we cannot accept in ourselves, and we project them outward onto others. We see in them the monsters we refuse to see in ourselves, and then we persecute them, we judge them, we dehumanize them, all while congratulating ourselves on our own moral superiority. This is the great and terrible secret of human psychology. We do not hate others despite their differences from us. We hate them because of their similarities to us, because they remind us of the parts of ourselves we have tried to kill, because they embody the traits we have exiled, because they are living, breathing proof that the thing we claim to be immune to, that weakness, that flaw, that sin, exists within the human psyche. And if it exists in them, it might exist in us, and we cannot tolerate that thought. So we destroy the mirror rather than look at our reflection. But here is what Jung discovered. The shadow cannot be destroyed. It can only be integrated. And integration is not a process of becoming good. It is a process of becoming whole. It is recognizing that you contain multitudes, that you are capable of both great kindness and great cruelty, that you have both light and darkness within you, that you are not the simple, one-dimensional character you have constructed in your own story. You are complex. You are contradictory. You are human. And humanity, at its fullest expression, contains everything: the saint and the sinner, the hero and the villain, the lover and the murderer, not as separate beings, but as potentials within the same psyche. The question is not whether you contain darkness. The question is whether you will acknowledge it, whether you will face it, whether you will integrate it, or whether you will continue to deny it until it destroys you. Tonight, we explore this terrain together. We will trace Jung's discovery of the shadow from its origins in his own psyche to its expression in the collective unconscious of humanity. We will examine the mechanisms by which the shadow operates. We will investigate the consequences of shadow denial at both the personal and societal level. We will explore the process of shadow integration, what Jung called individuation, and we will consider what this ancient psychological wisdom means for our modern world, where technology threatens to amplify our shadows to civilizational scale. This journey will not be comfortable. Truth rarely is. But discomfort is not the same as harm, and sometimes the most healing thing we can do is to stop running from ourselves, to turn around, to face the darkness, to say, yes, this too is me, and I am strong enough to acknowledge it. Because here is the ultimate paradox that Jung understood. The shadow is not your enemy. It is your power. The traits you have repressed often contain your greatest strengths. The emotions you have denied often hold your deepest wisdom. The parts of yourself you have rejected often embody your most authentic self. The darkness does not exist to destroy you. It exists to complete you, to make you whole, to return to you the energy and vitality you have wasted in the constant, exhausting effort of self-suppression. So let us begin this descent, not with fear, but with courage, not with shame, but with curiosity, not with the goal of becoming perfect, but with the intention of becoming real. Because in the end, Jung's warning is also an invitation to meet yourself fully, to embrace your wholeness, to stop being the fragmented, half-alive person you have become through decades of self-rejection, to become, instead, something far more dangerous and far more beautiful, completely, uncomfortably, gloriously human. The shadow awaits, and it has been waiting for you your entire life. To understand the shadow, we must first understand how Carl Jung came to discover it. And that story begins not in a laboratory or a lecture hall, but in a moment of psychological crisis that nearly destroyed him. It begins with a break, a rupture, a descent into his own unconscious that would change not only his life, but our entire understanding of the human mind. The year was 1913. Jung was 38 years old, at the height of his professional success. He had been Sigmund Freud's chosen successor, his crown prince, the man who was supposed to carry forward the psychoanalytic revolution. But Jung was beginning to see cracks in Freud's theories. He was beginning to question whether the unconscious was simply a repository of repressed sexual trauma. He was beginning to sense something deeper, older, more universal operating in the human psyche. And when he finally voiced these doubts, the relationship shattered. Freud, who could not tolerate dissent, cut him off completely. And Jung found himself suddenly alone, professionally isolated, his career in ruins. But the external crisis was nothing compared to what was happening internally. Because when Jung broke with Freud, something broke within Jung himself. He began experiencing what he would later call a confrontation with the unconscious. He had waking visions. He heard voices. He saw images of catastrophe, cities drowning in blood, corpses floating in rivers, entire civilizations collapsing into chaos. He thought he was going mad. He thought he was losing his grip on reality. And in a sense, he was. He was losing his grip on the carefully constructed persona he had built, the successful psychiatrist, the rational scientist, the civilized European gentleman. And beneath that persona, something else was emerging, something he did not recognize, something that terrified him. This was Jung's first real encounter with his shadow, and he made a decision that would define his entire life's work. He decided not to run from it, not to suppress it, not to medicate it or rationalize it away. He decided to meet it, to engage with it, to explore it. He began what he called active imagination, a process of dialoguing with the unconscious contents of his mind. He would sit with a pen and paper and simply allow images, thoughts, voices to emerge. And he would record them, without judgment, without interpretation, without trying to control or direct them. What emerged was astonishing. He encountered autonomous figures from his unconscious, archetypal characters that seemed to have their own intelligence, their own intentions, their own reality. He met an old man named Philemon, who became a kind of inner guide. He encountered a feminine figure he called his anima, and he encountered darker figures too, shadow figures, aspects of himself he had never acknowledged, violent impulses, sexual desires, power fantasies, resentments, hatreds, all the things a civilized man was not supposed to feel. And here is what Jung realized. These were not pathological symptoms. They were not signs of mental illness. They were the natural contents of the human psyche. They were parts of himself that had been repressed, denied, split off from consciousness. And by giving them expression, by allowing them to speak, to be seen, to exist, he was not descending into madness. He was ascending into wholeness. This is the fundamental insight that would shape Jung's entire psychology. The psyche seeks wholeness, not perfection. It seeks integration, not elimination. The goal of psychological development is not to become a better version of yourself, but to become a fuller version of yourself. And that means encountering everything, the light and the dark, the acceptable and the unacceptable, the civilized and the savage, the conscious and the unconscious, the persona and the shadow. But what exactly is the shadow? Jung defined it as the part of the unconscious mind consisting of repressed weaknesses, shortcomings, and instincts. It is everything that the ego, the conscious self, refuses to identify with. It is formed through the process of socialization starting in childhood, as we learn what is acceptable and what is not. When a child is told, "Big boys don't cry," The capacity for emotional vulnerability goes into the shadow. When a girl is told, "Nice girls don't get angry," the capacity for healthy aggression goes into the shadow. When we are taught that certain desires are shameful, those desires go into the shadow. When we are socialized to believe that certain traits are incompatible with our identity, those traits go into the shadow. This process is universal and unavoidable. Every human being develops a shadow. There is no escaping it. Because every culture, every family, every social group has rules about what is acceptable. And whatever falls outside those rules gets repressed. What varies is not whether we have a shadow, but what's in our shadow. A person raised in a culture that values aggression and dominance will have gentleness and compassion in their shadow. A person raised in a culture that values harmony and conformity will have individuality and rebellion in their shadow. The content changes, but the structure remains the same. And here is the crucial point. The shadow is not inherently evil. It is not the bad part of you. It is simply the disowned part of you. Yes, it often contains traits we would consider negative: rage, jealousy, cruelty, selfishness. But it also contains positive traits that were deemed unacceptable: creativity that was too wild, sexuality that was too intense, ambition that was too bold, intelligence that was too threatening, power that was too dangerous. The shadow is not a moral category. It is a psychological category. It is everything that consciousness has rejected. Jung traced this concept back through mythology and religion and found it everywhere. In every culture, in every era, humanity has told stories about the divided self. The doppelganger in German folklore, the ghostly double that haunts its original. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in Victorian literature, the civilized doctor and his monstrous alter ego. The concept of the devil in Christianity, the fallen angel who represents everything God is not. These were not random superstitions. These were psychological insights encoded in symbol and story. Humanity has always known, at some level, that we are not unified, that we contain contradictions, that there is a part of us we dare not face. But the consequences of not facing it are severe. Jung observed that unacknowledged shadow material does not remain passive. It becomes active. It takes on a life of its own. It operates autonomously, influencing behaviour in ways the conscious mind does not recognize or understand. This is why people often act in ways that contradict their stated values, why the politician who campaigns on family values gets caught in a scandal, why the priest who preaches purity commits abuse, why the activist who fights for justice becomes the bully. It's not hypocrisy in the simple sense. It's the shadow, operating in the dark, expressing the rejected parts of the psyche through the only channels available. Jung also noticed something even more disturbing. The shadow is often projected outward onto others. We see in other people the traits we cannot acknowledge in ourselves, and we hate them for it. We judge them. We condemn them. We feel righteous in our opposition to them. This is projection, and it is everywhere. It is in every political conflict, every religious war, every personal grudge. The enemy is never just the enemy. The enemy is the externalized shadow, the repository of everything we refuse to see in ourselves. Think about the traits you most despise in others, the things that make your blood boil, the characteristics that seem unforgivable. Now consider the possibility, uncomfortable as it may be, that you possess these traits yourself. Perhaps not in the same form, perhaps not in the same intensity, but somewhere, in some shadow corner of your psyche, those traits exist, and your hatred of them out there is proportional to your denial of them in here. The stronger the projection, the more deeply the trait is buried in your own shadow. Jung saw this dynamic playing out not just in individuals, but in entire societies. He watched as Germany in the 1930s projected its collective shadow onto the Jews, creating scapegoats for everything the culture could not accept about itself. He understood that the Holocaust was not an aberration, but a catastrophic example of what happens when a society refuses to face its collective darkness. When an entire nation denies its shadow, the result is not peace and harmony, The result is apocalypse. This is why Jung's warning is so urgent, because we are not just dealing with personal psychology here. We are dealing with the psychological forces that shape history, that drive societies to war, that enable genocides, that turn neighbor against neighbor. The shadow, when denied on a collective scale, becomes a force of destruction beyond imagination. And the tragedy is that it is completely avoidable. If we would simply turn around, if we would simply look, if we would simply acknowledge this darkness is not out there, it is in here, and only by facing it can we prevent it from consuming us. But Jung also discovered something hopeful. He found that the shadow, when integrated, becomes a source of tremendous energy and creativity. The repressed traits, when brought into consciousness and accepted, no longer sabotage from the darkness. They become resources, tools, strengths. A person who has integrated their shadow is more alive, more authentic, more powerful than a person who remains fragmented. They have access to the full spectrum of human experience. They can be gentle when gentleness is needed and fierce when fierceness is needed. They can contain contradiction without fracturing. They can be fully human. This is the process Jung called individuation, the journey toward wholeness. And it always involves confronting the shadow. There is no shortcut. There is no way around it. The path to psychological maturity runs directly through the darkness we have spent our lives avoiding. And Jung knew this from personal experience. His own confrontation with the unconscious, his own meeting with his shadow, transformed him from a conventional psychiatrist into a visionary psychologist who would influence not just psychology, but philosophy, religion, art, and culture for generations to come. But the journey was not easy. Jung spent years in that darkness, years dialoguing with the voices in his head, years painting, writing, sculpting the images that emerged from his unconscious, years simply trying to understand what was happening to him. And there were moments when he wondered if he would make it out. Moments when the boundary between sanity and madness seemed paper-thin. Moments when he felt he was losing himself entirely. But he didn't lose himself. He found himself, the real self, the whole self. The self that contained both Jung, the respectable doctor, and Jung, the wild mystic. Jung, the rational scientist, and Jung, the irrational dreamer. Jung, the civilized man, and Jung, the primitive shaman. He became complete. And in becoming complete, he became capable of seeing humanity more clearly than perhaps anyone before him. He saw that we are all walking around fragmented, split, at war with ourselves, that we have taken the fullness of human nature and divided it into acceptable and unacceptable, good and bad, light and dark. And in doing so, we have crippled ourselves. We have cut ourselves off from our own vitality. We have become half alive, zombies stumbling through life, playing roles we think we're supposed to play, while our authentic selves scream from the basement of consciousness. And Jung's message, his warning, his invitation is this: you don't have to live that way. You can meet your shadow. You can face what you have been running from. You can integrate what you have rejected. You can become whole, but you have to choose it. You have to be willing to descend. You have to be willing to see yourself fully, clearly, honestly, without the comforting lies, without the protective stories, without the persona you have constructed to make yourself acceptable to the world. This is the journey we are on tonight. This is the descent we are making, not because it is easy, but because it is necessary, not because it is comfortable, but because it is true. The shadow is real. It is operating in your life right now, in this moment. And the only question is, will you continue to deny it? Or will you finally, courageously, turn around and face it? The choice, as always, is yours. But now at least you know what you're choosing. The shadow does not ask for permission to exist. It does not wait for you to be ready. It does not care whether you believe in it or acknowledge it. It simply is. And when it is denied, when it is repressed, when it is locked away in the deepest dungeons of the psyche, it does not quietly disappear. It grows. It mutates. It becomes something far more dangerous than it ever would have been if simply acknowledged from the beginning. Jung understood this through direct observation, both of his patients and of human history. He watched as individuals destroyed their lives through shadow denial. He watched as societies descended into madness through collective shadow projection. And he recognized a pattern, a terrible progression that occurs when the shadow is systematically ignored. The first stage is denial. This is where most of us live most of the time. We genuinely do not see our own darkness. We have so successfully repressed it that we experience ourselves as fundamentally good, moral, reasonable people. When we do something unkind, we tell ourselves we were provoked. When we lie, we tell ourselves it was necessary. When we hurt someone, we tell ourselves they deserved it. We construct elaborate justifications for our behaviour because we cannot tolerate the possibility that we might contain the very traits we despise in others. This is not conscious deception. This is the ego doing its job, protecting consciousness from material it cannot integrate. The ego is like a bouncer at an exclusive club, standing at the threshold between conscious and unconscious, deciding what gets in and what stays out. And it is ruthless in its selectivity. Anything that threatens the ego's carefully constructed self-image gets rejected. Anything that contradicts our story about who we are gets repressed. And slowly, over years, over decades, we build a shadow that contains not just minor flaws, but entire dimensions of our humanity. Consider a man raised to believe that real men are always strong, always in control, always dominant. What happens to his vulnerability? What happens to his fear? What happens to his need for connection and tenderness? Those things do not disappear. They go into the shadow, and there, in the darkness, they do not remain pure and innocent. They become twisted. His unacknowledged need for tenderness might express itself as sexual aggression. His repressed vulnerability might express itself as defensive rage. His denied fear might express itself as dominating behaviour toward those weaker than him. The shadow takes the rejected traits and returns them to consciousness in distorted, destructive forms. Or consider a woman raised to believe that good women are always nurturing, always selfless, always accommodating. What happens to her anger? What happens to her ambition? What happens to her desire for power and recognition? Again, these do not disappear. They go into the shadow, and they express themselves in indirect manipulative ways, in passive aggression, in martyrdom, in subtle sabotage of those she envies. The shadow finds a way. It always finds a way. Jung noticed that the second stage after denial is projection. When shadow content becomes too powerful to remain entirely unconscious, it gets projected outward onto other people. We see our own disowned traits in others and react with disproportionate emotion. This is why certain people trigger us so intensely. This is why we can be irrationally bothered by traits in others that objectively don't affect us. A person with repressed greed might be obsessed with criticizing others for their materialism. A person with repressed sexuality might be obsessed with policing others' sexual behavior. A person with repressed prejudice might be obsessed with calling out others' racism. The content varies, but the mechanism is the same. What we cannot see in ourselves, we see everywhere else. And projection is insidious because it feels so righteous. When you are projecting, you genuinely believe you are perceiving reality accurately. You are not aware that you are looking at a mirror. You think you are looking through a window. The politician who rails against homosexuality while hiding his own same-sex desires truly believes he is fighting moral corruption. The religious leader who condemns others for their sins while committing worse ones himself truly believes he is serving God. The activist who becomes a tyrant in the name of justice truly believes she is making the world better. The unconscious is a master of self-deception, and projection is its favorite tool. But projection is not just a personal phenomenon, it is collective. Societies project their collective shadows onto marginalized groups. Jung watched this happen in Germany with the Jews, but it has happened throughout history with countless groups. The witch trials in Europe and America were not about witches. They were about the projection of the collective shadow, particularly female sexuality, power, and independence, onto vulnerable women who could be scapegoated. The persecution of heretics was not about protecting religious truth. It was about projecting the doubt and questioning that existed within the church onto those who dared to voice it openly. Slavery was not just about economic exploitation, it was about projecting the animal nature, the primitive impulses, the savage desires that civilized society denied in itself onto people who could be dehumanized. This is what makes the shadow so dangerous at the collective level. When an entire society agrees to repress certain traits, when an entire culture creates a collective shadow, that darkness does not disappear. It must find an outlet. And it finds it through scapegoating, through identifying an other who can carry all the rejected traits, and then persecuting that other with a ferocity that shocks the conscience. Because the intensity of the persecution is proportional to the intensity of the repression. The more deeply we deny our own darkness, the more violently we attack it in others. Jung saw this dynamic culminate in World War II and the Holocaust. He recognized that the Nazi ideology was a massive collective shadow projection. The Germans, who prided themselves on their civilization, their culture, their order, had repressed their chaos, their irrationality, their capacity for violence. And when economic collapse and social upheaval shattered their collective ego, the shadow erupted. But it erupted in a specific direction, toward the Jews, who were made to carry the projection of everything the German psyche could not acknowledge about itself. This is not to reduce the Holocaust to psychology. The Holocaust was a complex historical event with multiple causes: economic, political, ideological. But Jung understood that none of those causes could have produced such barbarism without the psychological mechanism of shadow projection operating at a mass scale, without an entire society agreeing to see its own darkness in the face of the other, and then attempting to annihilate that darkness through annihilating the other. And here is the terrifying truth. This can happen anywhere, to any society, at any time, because the shadow is universal, and the temptation to project it rather than integrate it is overwhelming. It is so much easier to blame others than to examine ourselves. So much easier to see evil out there than in here. So much easier to fight external enemies than internal demons. And when an entire society makes that choice, when an entire culture chooses projection over integration, the result is catastrophic. But the third stage of shadow denial is even more personal and perhaps more common. This is when the shadow erupts from within, destroying the individual from the inside. Jung called this enantiodromia, the tendency of things to transform into their opposite. The person who has been rigidly good suddenly commits an act of shocking evil. The person who has been tightly controlled suddenly loses all control. The person who has been meticulously moral suddenly reveals themselves to be profoundly corrupt. We see this pattern everywhere. The upstanding family man who one day vanishes his entire family. The dedicated professional who suddenly commits fraud or violence. The devout believer who abruptly abandons their faith and descends into dissolution. These are not random events. These are shadow eruptions. These are the return of the repressed. These are what happens when psychological pressure becomes too great, when the split between persona and shadow becomes too wide, when the denied parts of the self finally force their way into consciousness. And the eruption is always dramatic, always destructive, because the shadow has been building pressure for years, for decades. Every time an impulse was denied, every time an emotion was repressed, every time an authentic aspect of self was rejected, the energy didn't disappear, it accumulated, and when it finally breaks through, it does so with devastating force. Jung himself experienced a mild version of this when he broke with Freud. The carefully constructed persona of the successful psychoanalyst cracked, and what emerged was something wild, something primal, something that terrified him. But because he chose to meet it, to engage with it, to integrate it, he did not explode outward in destructive behaviour. He imploded inward in a transformative encounter with his own depths. This is the difference between eruption and integration, between explosion and evolution, between being destroyed by the shadow and being completed by it. But most people do not choose integration. Most people choose continued denial. And so the shadow continues to operate in the darkness, sabotaging their lives in countless ways. It sabotages relationships by projecting unresolved trauma onto partners. It sabotages careers by unconsciously repeating self-defeating patterns. It sabotages health by converting psychological conflict into physical symptoms. It sabotages happiness by ensuring that success is always followed by self-destruction. This is the shadow at work, not as a demon, not as an external force, but as the disowned parts of the self operating autonomously because they have been exiled from conscious awareness. Jung noticed something else in his clinical work. The shadow often expresses itself through what he called shadow attacks, sudden overwhelming emotions that seem to come from nowhere, rage that feels disproportionate to its trigger, jealousy that feels all-consuming, shame that feels unbearable. These are not character flaws, these are shadow eruptions. These are moments when the unconscious breaks through the ego's defenses and floods consciousness with material it has been trying to repress. And in those moments, people often do things they later cannot believe they did. They say things they swore they would never say. They hurt people they promised to protect. They become, for a moment, the very thing they most despise. And then, when consciousness reasserts control, they are left with guilt, confusion, denial. That wasn't really me, they tell themselves. I don't know what came over me. But Jung would say, that was you. That was the part of you that you have been denying. That was the shadow, taking control because you refused to give it a voice. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Jung's psychology. We are not the unified, coherent selves we imagine ourselves to be. We are multiplicities. We contain many selves, many voices, many competing desires and impulses, and when we try to pretend we are just one thing, just good, just rational, just civilized, we fracture, we split. We become dissociated from our own experience. And in that dissociation, the shadow gains power. It becomes more autonomous, more destructive, more capable of taking control without our awareness or consent. Jung saw this most clearly in cases of possession, not in the supernatural sense, but in the psychological sense. People who seemed to be taken over by something beyond themselves. And in a way, they were. They were being taken over by their own disowned psychic contents, which had become so autonomous that they functioned almost like separate personalities. This is not multiple personality disorder in the clinical sense. This is the normal structure of the psyche when shadow material is not integrated. We all experience moments when something came over us, when we weren't ourselves, when we acted out of character. These are not aberrations. These are glimpses of the shadow asserting itself. And here is the paradox. The harder we try to be perfect, the stronger the shadow becomes. The more rigidly we identify with the good self, the more powerful the bad self grows in the darkness. This is why the most moralistic people are often the most corrupt, why the most controlled people often have the most explosive breakdowns, why the people who seem the most together are often the most fragmented. Because psychological health is not about eliminating darkness, it is about integrating it. It is about acknowledging the full spectrum of human nature within oneself. Jung believed that the great task of the second half of life is to recover what was lost in the first half, to reclaim what was rejected, to integrate what was denied. In the first half of life, we necessarily develop a persona, a social mask that allows us to function in society. We repress parts of ourselves that don't fit with that persona. This is normal and necessary. But in the second half of life, if we want to become whole, we must turn around. We must journey back into the darkness. We must meet the shadow we have been running from. This is not comfortable work. This is not the work of self-improvement gurus who promise that you can simply affirm your way to happiness. This is the work of alchemy, of transformation, of descent into the underworld and return with treasure, of dying to who you thought you were and being reborn as who you actually are. And most people do not have the courage for it. Most people would rather remain fragmented and half alive than face the totality of their being. But for those who do undertake the journey, Jung promised something remarkable. They would discover that the shadow is not their enemy, that the darkness contains gifts, that the traits they have spent their lives repressing often include their greatest strengths, that creativity, sexuality, aggression, ambition, all the things they were taught to fear, might actually be sources of vitality and power when integrated rather than denied. This is the great revelation at the heart of Jungian psychology. Wholeness requires darkness. Healing requires descent. Transformation requires death. Not physical death, but ego death. Death of the false self. Death of the carefully constructed persona. Death of the illusion of perfection. And rebirth into authenticity, into completeness, into the fully human existence that includes both light and shadow, both strength and weakness, both beauty and horror. But we are not there yet. We are still in the conflict, still in the struggle, still watching as individuals and societies destroy themselves through shadow denial, still seeing the eruptions, the projections, the catastrophes that occur when we refuse to face ourselves. The question is, how do we escape this cycle? How do we stop the pattern of repression and explosion that has defined human psychology for millennia? How do we integrate what we have denied? That is where we turn next, to the process of awakening, to the confrontation with the shadow that transforms rather than destroys, to the alchemy of making the unconscious conscious, the dark light, the enemy ally, to the work that Jung devoted his life to understanding and teaching, the work of individuation, the work of becoming whole. The descent continues, and the darkness deepens. But somewhere in that darkness a light awaits, not the light of denial or repression, but the light that comes from seeing clearly, from seeing fully, from seeing ourselves as we truly are. There is a moment in every hero's journey when the protagonist realizes that the enemy they have been fighting is not external. The dragon is not in the cave, the monster is not in the labyrinth, the darkness is not in the world. It is in them. And in that moment of horrifying recognition, they have a choice: to continue the battle outward and destroy themselves in the process, or to turn inward and face what they have been fleeing from. This is the moment of awakening. This is the moment of transformation. This is the moment when the shadow stops being an enemy and becomes an ally. Jung discovered that integration of the shadow is not a single event, but a process, one that requires courage, honesty, and patience. He called it the confrontation with the unconscious, and he knew from his own experience that it was the most difficult and most important psychological work a person could undertake. Because until the shadow is integrated, we remain fragmented. We remain at war with ourselves. We remain half alive, half real, half present. We are ghosts haunting our own lives, playing roles we think we should play, while our authentic selves scream silently from the basement. The first step in shadow integration is recognition. This is harder than it sounds, because the shadow, by definition, is what we cannot see in ourselves. It is the blind spot, the unconscious content, the part of us that operates below the threshold of awareness. So how do we recognize what is, by definition, unrecognizable? Jung offered several methods. The first method is projection analysis. Pay attention to who triggers you. Pay attention to the traits in others that evoke disproportionate emotion. Hatred, disgust, contempt, but also fascination, obsession, envy. These are your clues. Because if you are having an intense emotional reaction to someone else's characteristic, there is a very good chance you possess that characteristic yourself in some form. The stronger the reaction, the deeper the shadow material. The politician whose corruption enrages you? Look at the ways you compromise your own integrity, perhaps in smaller ways, perhaps in different domains, but the pattern is there. The person whose neediness irritates you? Look at your own unmet needs, your own denied dependency, your own vulnerability that you have learned to despise. The person whose confidence you resent? Look at your own suppressed ambition, your own hidden arrogance, your own rejected power. This is not pleasant work. This is not the work of feeling good about yourself. This is the work of seeing yourself clearly. And what you see will not always be pretty. You will discover that you are capable of pettiness, of cruelty, of selfishness, of all the traits you have spent your life claiming to be above. But here is the paradox. This discovery is liberating, because as long as you are denying these traits, you are giving them power. As long as you are projecting them onto others, they control you. But when you can look directly at them and say, yes, this is part of me too, they lose their charge. They become just another aspect of your humanity, rather than a shameful secret that must be hidden. The second method Jung suggested is dream analysis. The shadow often appears in dreams as a figure of the same sex as the dreamer, a dark double, a threatening stranger, a criminal, a madman, a monster. But sometimes it appears as someone you know, someone who embodies traits you have rejected. Pay attention to these figures. They are not random. They are messengers from your unconscious, trying to show you what you need to see. Jung would ask his patients to dialogue with these dream figures, to ask them questions, to listen to their responses, to treat them not as threats to be eliminated, but as parts of the self trying to be heard. One of Jung's most famous techniques was what he called active imagination, a process of consciously engaging with unconscious content. You sit quietly, pen in hand, or before a blank canvas, and you allow images, thoughts, voices to emerge without censorship or direction. And then you engage with them, you draw them, you write their words, you have conversations with them. Jung himself did this extensively during his own confrontation with the unconscious, filling what would become known as the Red Book with paintings and dialogues with figures from his inner world. This was not art therapy in the modern sense. This was ontological exploration. This was treating the contents of the unconscious as real, as valid, as worthy of attention and relationship. The third method is simply honest self-reflection. This requires dropping the defenses, dropping the justifications, dropping the story you tell yourself about who you are, and asking, with genuine curiosity, what am I capable of? Not what would I do in my best moments, but what might I do in my worst? Not who do I want to be, but who am I actually? Jung believed that most people spend their entire lives avoiding these questions because the answers are too threatening to the ego. But he also believed that asking them was the only way to become real. Consider the thought experiments that reveal shadow material. If you knew you wouldn't get caught, what would you do? If social consequences were removed, what would you say? If you had absolute power, how would you use it? These hypotheticals are not idle speculation. They reveal what exists in the shadow, the desires you tell yourself you don't have, the impulses you insist you've transcended, the capacities you claim you lack. All there, waiting in the darkness. But recognition is only the first step. The second step is acceptance. This is where most people fail, because it is one thing to recognize your shadow, and quite another to accept it. Acceptance does not mean acting on every impulse. It does not mean becoming your worst self. It means acknowledging without judgment that these impulses, these traits, these capacities exist within you. It means ceasing the exhausting work of denial and allowing yourself to simply be complex, contradictory, human. Jung noticed that people who successfully integrated their shadow often experienced a strange sense of relief, as if they had been holding their breath their entire lives and could finally exhale, as if they had been performing a role that never quite fit and could finally take off the costume. There is a deep peace that comes with no longer having to pretend, with no longer having to maintain the fiction of perfection, with being able to say, I contain multitudes, I am capable of both great good and great harm, and that is not a flaw, that is humanity. The third step is expression. Integrated shadow material must find constructive outlets. This does not mean giving yourself permission to be cruel or selfish or destructive. It means finding ways to channel shadow energy that are life-affirming rather than life-denying. A person with repressed aggression might take up martial arts or competitive sports. A person with repressed sexuality might explore healthy, consensual forms of erotic expression. A person with repressed ambition might finally pursue the goals they have been afraid to acknowledge. A person with repressed creativity might begin making art that expresses the darkness they have spent their lives hiding. Jung observed that many of his patients, after integrating their shadow, became more creative, more energized, more alive. This makes sense. They were no longer wasting enormous amounts of psychic energy on repression. They were no longer fighting themselves. They could redirect that energy toward growth, toward creation, toward authentic self-expression. The shadow, when integrated, becomes a source of vitality rather than a source of sabotage. The fourth step is relationship. Shadow integration changes how we relate to others. When we stop projecting our darkness onto others, we stop needing enemies. We stop needing scapegoats. We stop dividing the world into good people and bad people, enlightened and unenlightened, us and them. We recognize that everyone contains the same full spectrum of human nature that we do, and this recognition breeds compassion. Not the cheap compassion of pity or condescension, but the deep compassion that comes from recognizing our shared humanity, from knowing that there but for the grace of God go I, from understanding that we are all struggling with the same fundamental challenge, how to be whole in a world that demands we be partial. Jung believed that shadow work was not just personal but collective, that as individuals integrated their personal shadows, they contributed to the healing of the collective shadow. That consciousness was not just an individual phenomenon, but a collective one, and that by doing our own inner work, we were participating in the evolution of human consciousness itself. This was not narcissism, this was responsibility, because unintegrated individuals create unintegrated societies, and unintegrated societies create the conditions for catastrophe. Think about what the world would look like if everyone did their shadow work, if everyone stopped projecting their darkness onto others, if everyone took responsibility for their own capacity for cruelty, for prejudice, for violence. We would not have to eliminate these capacities. That is impossible. But we would no longer be unconsciously enacting them while congratulating ourselves on our virtue. We would not need scapegoats. We would not need enemies. We would not need to dehumanize others to maintain our own sense of goodness. We could meet each other as fellow travelers in the human condition, each carrying both light and darkness, each struggling to become whole. This is the vision that animated Jung's work, not a utopian fantasy where everyone becomes enlightened and perfect, but a mature vision where everyone becomes more conscious, more honest, more integrated, more human, where we stop pretending to be what we are not and start embracing what we are, where psychological maturity is measured not by how good we appear to be, but by how whole we actually are. But Jung also warned that shadow integration is never complete. It is not a one-time event after which you can declare yourself finished. It is a lifelong process. Because as you grow, as circumstances change, new shadow material emerges. Traits that were once integrated may become repressed again under new conditions, Aspects of self that were acceptable in one phase of life may become unacceptable in another. The shadow is dynamic, always shifting, always presenting new material for consciousness to engage with. This is why Jung emphasized the need for ongoing self-reflection, ongoing honesty, ongoing willingness to see oneself clearly. He compared it to keeping a house clean. It is never done. There is always dust accumulating, always clutter building up, always the need to look again, to examine again, to integrate again. But unlike cleaning a house, shadow work becomes easier with practice. You develop the muscles for it. You become familiar with your own patterns. You learn to recognize the signs that shadow material is active. And you develop the tools to meet it with consciousness rather than denial. One of the most powerful tools Jung offered was what he called holding the tension of opposites. This is the ability to contain contradiction without collapsing into binary thinking, to recognize that you can be both kind and cruel, both strong and weak, both generous and selfish, both wise and foolish, not at different times, but simultaneously, that these opposites are not exclusive, but complementary, that they exist in constant dynamic relationship, and that wholeness emerges not from choosing one and rejecting the other, but from holding both. This is exceptionally difficult in a culture that demands consistency, that punishes hypocrisy, that insists we be one thing or another. But Jung argued that this cultural demand is itself a form of psychological violence. It forces us to fragment ourselves to fit into neat categories. It makes us choose between dimensions of our humanity that should be integrated. It creates the very shadow we then spend our lives trying to escape. Real psychological maturity, according to Jung, is the ability to contain complexity, to be comfortable with ambiguity, to accept that you will never be just one thing, that you will always be a mixture, and that this mixture is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be embraced. The person who has truly integrated their shadow no longer needs to present themselves as entirely good. They can admit flaws, they can acknowledge mistakes, they can be vulnerable, because they are no longer defending a fragile ego image. They are resting in the solid ground of wholeness. And here is where Jung's psychology becomes genuinely radical, because he is not offering us a path to become better people in the conventional sense. He is offering us a path to become complete people. And complete people are not necessarily nice. They are not necessarily agreeable. They are not necessarily what society wants them to be. But they are real. They are authentic. They are integrated. And there is a power in that integration that goes beyond conventional morality. Jung observed that many of his patients, after integrating their shadow, became less interested in external validation and more interested in internal coherence. They stopped caring so much what others thought of them because they knew themselves fully. They stopped performing goodness and started living according to their own values. They became, in a word, individuated, not individualistic, that is narcissism, but individuated, connected to their own depths, their own truth, their own wholeness. This is the promise of shadow work, not that you will become perfect, but that you will become real, not that you will transcend your humanity, but that you will fully embody it, not that you will eliminate darkness, but that you will integrate it into a life of greater authenticity, greater vitality, greater consciousness. And in a world that is increasingly superficial, increasingly fragmented, increasingly dissociated from depth, this kind of realness is revolutionary. It is the antidote to the shallow narcissism of Instagram filters and personal branding. It is the answer to the epidemic of anxiety and depression that comes from living inauthentically. It is the path to becoming actually alive, rather than just going through the motions of a life you think you should be living. But it requires courage, more courage than most people possess, because it requires looking at yourself without flinching. It requires admitting things about yourself that you have spent decades denying. It requires giving up the comforting story that you are simply a good person who occasionally makes mistakes. It requires recognizing that you are a complex person who contains the entire spectrum of human nature, the sacred and the profane, the beautiful and the ugly, the noble and the base. And for most people, that recognition is too much. They would rather remain in comfortable self-deception than face uncomfortable truth. But for those who are ready, for those who have been called to this work, for those who can no longer tolerate the half-life of shadow denial, Jung offers a map. Not a guaranteed path, not a step-by-step program, but a map of the territory, a description of what you will encounter when you descend into your own underworld, a set of tools for engaging with what you find there, and most importantly, a promise that the journey is worth it, that what awaits you in the darkness is not destruction, but completion, not death, but rebirth, not the end of who you are, but the beginning of who you can become. The shadow is waiting. It has always been waiting, patient in its darkness, ready to be met, ready to be seen, ready to be integrated. The only question is, are you ready? Are you willing to turn around? Are you willing to face what you have been running from? Are you willing to become whole? This is the awakening. This is the moment of transformation. This is when the journey truly begins. We stand now at a threshold unlike any in human history. Jung lived in a time when the primary threat was humanity's collective shadow erupting through war and genocide. He warned that without massive psychological transformation, civilization would destroy itself. And he was right. The 20th century became the bloodiest in human history precisely because of the dynamics he identified: projection, scapegoating, and the mass eruption of unintegrated darkness. But now we face something even more dangerous. We are creating technologies that can amplify our shadows to species-level scale. Artificial intelligence that learns from human data learns also from human shadow material, our biases, our prejudices, our cruelties. Social media platforms that operate on the principle of engagement amplify the very projections Jung warned against, creating echo chambers where everyone sees their shadow reflected in the other side. Surveillance systems that promise security actually serve the paranoid dimensions of the collective psyche. Weapon systems that can destroy civilization in minutes embody our unconscious death drive. The shadow is no longer just psychological. It is technological. It is collective. And it is accelerating toward a point of no return. Jung believed that humanity had reached a critical juncture where we had to choose, become conscious or perish. That choice remains. But the stakes have grown exponentially, because we now possess the technological power to actualize our darkest unconscious contents on a global scale. Every day that we refuse to do our shadow work is a day that our collective darkness becomes more dangerous. Not because we are becoming more evil, but because we are becoming more powerful while remaining unconscious. This is why Jung's work is not just relevant, but urgent. Why shadow integration is not just personal development, but civilizational necessity. Why the most important question facing humanity might not be technological, but psychological. Can we become conscious quickly enough? Can we integrate our shadows before they destroy us? Can we evolve psychologically at the pace our technology demands? There are signs of hope. More people are waking up to the need for inner work. Contemplative practices are entering mainstream culture. Therapy is becoming destigmatized. There is a growing recognition that external solutions cannot solve problems that originate internally, that we cannot regulate our way out of our shadow, that we cannot engineer our way out of our unconscious, that the work must be done internally, individually, consciously, courageously. But there is also tremendous resistance, because shadow work is difficult. It is uncomfortable. It requires us to give up comforting illusions. It requires us to face aspects of ourselves we have spent our lives avoiding. It requires us to become responsible for our own darkness rather than blaming it on others. And most people, when given the choice between comfortable unconsciousness and uncomfortable consciousness, choose unconsciousness. The question is, what will you choose, now that you know what the shadow is? Now that you understand how it operates, now that you see it active in your own life, in your own relationships, in your own society, will you continue to deny it? Will you continue to project it? Will you continue to let it operate autonomously in the darkness of your unconscious? Or will you turn around? Will you face it? Will you integrate it? This is not just about you. This is about the future of consciousness itself. Because every person who does their shadow work contributes to the collective consciousness. Every person who stops projecting contributes to reducing collective conflict. Every person who becomes integrated contributes to the possibility of an integrated society. Individual psychology and collective psychology are not separate. They are mirrors of each other. And the work you do on yourself ripples outward in ways you cannot see, but that are nonetheless real. Jung spent his life calling us toward this work, warning us of the consequences of avoiding it, showing us the path through it. He gave us a map of the unconscious, tools for engaging with shadow material, a vision of what wholeness might look like. But he cannot do the work for us. No one can. The confrontation with the shadow is ultimately solitary. It is each person's own hero's journey into their own underworld, and it is waiting for you now. So ask yourself, what have I been denying? What traits do I see in others that I refuse to acknowledge in myself? What emotions have I repressed? What desires have I disowned? What aspects of my humanity have I rejected? These questions are not comfortable, but they are necessary, because until you can answer them honestly, you remain fragmented. You remain at war with yourself. You remain only partially alive. The shadow is not your enemy. The shadow is your wholeness, waiting to be claimed. The darkness is not what you need to eliminate. The darkness is what you need to integrate. The journey into the unconscious is not a descent into hell. It is a descent into humanity, into the fullness of what it means to be real rather than perfect, whole rather than partial, authentically yourself rather than a performance for others. This is Jung's final warning and his ultimate invitation. Become conscious or be destroyed by your own unconscious. Face your shadow or be consumed by it. Integrate your darkness or watch it erupt and devastate everything you love. The choice has always been yours. The shadow has always been waiting, and time, as it always does, is running out. But there is also this. On the other side of the shadow lies something extraordinary. A life of greater vitality, greater authenticity, greater consciousness, a self that is complete rather than fragmented, a way of being in the world that is honest rather than performed, and a contribution to the evolution of consciousness that transcends your individual existence. This is not grandiose. This is simply what happens when you do the work, when you turn around, when you face what you have been fleeing from. The shadow is calling. It has your voice, it knows your name, and it will wait as long as necessary for you to finally, courageously turn around and say, I see you, I acknowledge you, I accept you, you are part of me, and I am ready to become whole. This is where the descent ends, and where the real journey begins. May you have the courage to take the first step. May you have the honesty to see what needs to be seen. May you have the strength to integrate what has been denied. May you become whole. The shadow is yours. Claim it, before it claims you. Thank you for walking this path into the darkness with me, for allowing yourself to consider uncomfortable truths, for being willing to look at the parts of human nature and your own nature that our culture teaches us to ignore. Jung's work on the shadow is perhaps his greatest gift to humanity, not because it makes us feel good, but because it makes us whole. Not because it offers easy answers, but because it asks the right questions. Not because it promises perfection, but because it offers the possibility of integration. Remember this: every hero's journey includes a descent. Every transformation includes a death. Every awakening includes a confrontation with darkness. This is not tragic. This is the structure of growth, and you are capable of this journey. You always have been. The shadow is not waiting to destroy you. It is waiting to complete you. The question now is simple. Will you descend? The choice, as always, was always yours.